Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17. Oliver's destiny, continuing, Unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by fetters and misfortunes. In the next scene, his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold with throbbing bosoms the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings. Seneschal. Seneschal, a steward or major domo of a medieval great house, or a governor or other administrative or judicial officer. And we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals, who are free of all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, and roam about in company, carolling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they are not so unnatural as they would seem at first sight. The transitions in real life from well-spread boards to deathbeds, and from mourning weeds to holiday garments, are not a whit less startling. Only there we are busy actors instead of passive lookers-on, which makes a vast difference. The actors in the mimic life of the theatre are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling, which, presented before the eyes of mere spectators, are at once condemned as outrageous and preposterous. As sudden shiftings of the scene and rapid changes of time and place are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered as the great art of authorship, an author's skill in his craft being, by such critics, chiefly estimated with relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of every chapter. This brief introduction to the present one may perhaps be deemed unnecessary. If so, let it be considered a delicate imitation on the part of the historian that he is going back to the town in which Oliver Twist was born, the reader taking it for granted that there are good and substantial reasons for making the journey, or he would not be invited to proceed upon such an expedition. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate, and walked with portly carriage and commanding steps up the High Street. He was in full bloom and pride of beadlehood. His cocked hat and coat were dazzling in the morning sun. He clutched his cane with the vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was an abstraction in his eye, an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beadle's mind too great for utterance. Mr. Beadle stopped not to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him, deferentially as he passed along. He merely returned their salutations and waved with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not in his dignified pace until he reached the farm where Mrs. Mann tended the infant paupers with parochial care. Parochial, relating to a church parish. "Drat that beadle!" said Mrs. Mann, hearing the well-known shaking at the garden gate. "If it isn't him at this time in the morning! Look, Mr. Bumble only thinks of its being you. Well, dear me, it is a pleasure, this is. Come into the parlour, sir, please." The first sentence was addressed to Susan, and the exclamations of delight were uttered to Mr. Bumble as the good lady unlocked the garden gate and showed him with great attention and respect into the house. "Mrs. Mann," said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon or dropping himself into a seat as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually and slowly down into a chair. "Mrs. Mann, ma'am, good morning." "Well, and good morning to you, sir," replied Mrs. Mann with many smiles. "And hoping you find yourself well, sir." So, Mrs. Mann," replied the beadle. "A parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Mann." "Ah, that it isn't indeed, Mr. Bumble," rejoined the lady, and all the infant paupers might have chorused the rejoinder with great propriety, if they had heard it. "A parochial life, ma'am," continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane, "is a life of worrit and vexation and hardihood, but all public characters, as I may say, must suffer prosecution." Mrs. Mann, not very well knowing what the beadle meant, raised her hands with a look of sympathy and sighed. "Ah, you may well sigh, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. Finding she had done right, Mrs. Mann sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, "Mrs. Mann, I am going to London." "Look, Mr. Bumble!" cried Mrs. Mann, starting back. "To London, ma'am," resumed the inflexible beadle. By coach, I and 2 paupers, Mrs. Mann. A legal action is a-coming on about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Mrs. Mann, to dispose to the matter before the quarter sessions at Clerkenwell. And I very much question," added Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up, "whether the Clerkenwell sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they have done with me." "Oh, you mustn't be too hard upon them, sir," said Mrs. Mann coaxingly. "The Clerkenwell sessions have brought it upon themselves, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble. "And if the Clerkenwell sessions find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell sessions have only themselves to thank." There was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered himself of these words, that Mrs. Mann appeared quite awed by them. At length she said, "You're going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts."
"That's when they're ill, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. "We put the sick paupers into open carts in the rainy weather to prevent their taking cold."
"Oh," said Mrs. Mann.
The opposition coach contracts for these too, and takes them cheap," said Mr. Bumble. "They are both in a very low state, and we find it would come £2 cheaper to move him than to bury him. That is, if we can throw him upon another parish, which I think we shall be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us."
When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave.
"We are forgetting business, ma'am," said the beadle. "Here is your parochial stipend for the month."
Mr. Bumble produced some silver money, rolled up in paper, from his pocketbook, and requested a receipt, which Mrs. Mann wrote. "It's very much blotted, sir," said the farmer of infants, but it's formal enough, I dare say. Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir. I am very much obliged to you, I'm sure." Mr. Bumble nodded blandly in acknowledgement of Mrs. Mann's curtsy, and inquired how the children were. "Bless their dear little hearts," said Mrs. Mann with emotion. "They're as well as can be, the dears. Of course, except the 2 that died last week, and little Dick."
"Isn't that boy no better?"
inquired Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann shook her head.
"He's a ill-conditioned, vicious, bad-disposed parochial child, that," said Mr. Bumble angrily. "Where is he?"
"I'll bring him to you in 1 minute, sir," replied Mrs. Mann. "Here you, Dick!" After some calling, Dick was discovered. Having had his face put under the pump and dried upon Mrs. Mann's gown, he was led into the awful presence of Mr. Bumble, the beadle. The child was pale and thin, his cheeks were sunken and his eyes large and bright. The scanty parish dress, the livery of his misery, hung loosely on his feeble body, and his young limbs had wasted away like those of an old man. Such was the little being who stood trembling beneath Mr. Bumble's glance, not daring to lift his eyes from the floor, and dreading even to hear the beadle's voice. "Can't you look at the gentleman, you obstinate boy?" said Mrs. Mann. The child meekly raised his eyes and encountered those of Mr. Bumble.
"What's the matter with you, you parochial Dick? What's the matter with you, parochial Dick?"
inquired Mr. Bumble with well-timed jocularity. Jocular, fond of or characterized by joking, humorous or playful.
"What's the matter with you, parochial Dick?"
inquired Mr. Bumble with well-timed jocularity. "Nothing, sir," replied the child faintly. "I should think not," said Mrs. Mann, who had of course laughed very much at Mr. Bumble's humour.
"You want for nothing, I'm sure."
"I should like," faltered the child. "Heyday!" interposed Mrs. Mann. "I suppose you're going to say that you do want for something now. Why, you little wretch!"
"Stop, Mrs. Mann, stop!"
said the beadle, raising his hand with a show of authority.
"Like what, sir? Eh?"
"I should like," said the child, to leave my dear love to poor Oliver Twist, and to let him know how often I have sat by myself and cried to think of his wandering about in the dark nights with nobody to help him. And I should like to tell him," said the child, pressing his small hands together and speaking with great fervour. Fervour, intense and passionate feeling. Fervour, said the child, pressing his small hands together and speaking with great fervour. "That I was glad to die when I was very young, for perhaps if I had lived to be a man and had grown old, my little sister who is in heaven might forget me or be unlike me, and it would be so much happier if we were both children there together." Mr. Bumble surveyed the little speaker from head to foot with indescribable astonishment, and turning to his companion said,
"They're all in one story, Mrs. Mann. That audacious Oliver had demogalized them all. Demogalized them all.
Demogalized.
Demogalized.
No word found.
Demogalized.
Demogalized is a corrupted form of the word demoralized, used by the character Bumble in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, to describe how Oliver's request for more food has broken the spirit or shaken the authority of the workhouse staff. It is meant as a comical misspelling, bastardization. Demogalized.
They're all in one story, Mrs. Mann. That audacious Oliver had demogalized them all.
"I couldn't have believed it, sir," said Mrs. Mann, holding up her hands and looking malignantly at Dick. "I never see such a hardened little wretch."
"Take him away, ma'am,"
said Mr. Bumble imperiously.
"This must be stated to the board, Mrs. Mann."
"I hope the gentlemen will understand that it isn't my fault, sir," said Mrs. Mann, whimpering pathetically.
"They shall understand that, ma'am. They shall be acquainted with the true state of the cause,"
said Mr. Bumble.
"There, take him away. I can't bear the sight on him."
Dick was immediately taken away and locked up in the coal cellar. Mr. Bumble shortly afterwards took himself off to prepare for his journey. At 6 o'clock next morning, Mr. Bumble, having exchanged his cocked hat for a round one, and encased his person in a blue greatcoat with a cape to it, took his place on the outside of the coach, accompanied by the criminals whose settlement was disputed, with whom, in due course of time, he arrived in London. He experienced no other crosses on the way than those which originated in the perverse behaviour of the two paupers, who persisted in shivering and complaining of the cold, in a manner which Mr. Bumble declared caused his teeth to chatter in his head, and made him feel quite uncomfortable, although he had a great coat on. Having disposed of these evil-minded persons for the night, Mr. Bumble sat himself down in the house at which the coach stopped, and took a temperate dinner of steaks, oyster sauce, and porter. Putting a glass of hot gin and water on the chimney-piece, he drew his chair to the fire, and with sundry moral reflections on the two prevalent sin of discontent and complaining, composed himself to read the paper. The very first paragraph upon which Mr. Bumble's eyes rested was the following advertisement. 5 guineas reward. Whereas a young boy named Oliver Twist absconded, or was enticed, on Thursday evening last from his home at Pentonville, and has not since been heard of. The above reward will be paid to any person who will give such information as will lead to the discovery of the said Oliver Twist, or tend to throw any light upon his previous history, in which the advertiser is, for many reasons, warmly interested." And then followed a full description of Oliver's dress, person, appearance, and disappearance, with the name and address of Mr. Brownlow at full length. Mr. Bumble opened his eyes, read the advertisement slowly and carefully, 3 several times, and in something more than 5 minutes was on his way to Pentonville, having actually, in his excitement, left the glass of hot gin and water untasted. "Is Mr. Brownlow at home?" inquired Mr. Bumble of the girl who opened the door. To this inquiry the girl returned the not uncommon, but rather evasive reply of, "I don't know. Where do you come from?" Mr. Bumble no sooner uttered Oliver's name in explanation of his errand than Mrs. Bedwin, who had been listening at the parlour door, hastened into the passage in a breathless state. Oh, come in, said the old lady. "I knew we should hear of him. Poor dear, I knew we should. I was certain of it. Bless his heart, I said so all along. Having heard this, the worthy old lady hurried back into the parlour again, and seating herself on a sofa, burst into tears. The girl, who was not quite so susceptible, had run upstairs meanwhile, and now returned with a request that Mr. Bumble would follow her immediately, which he did. He was shown into the little back study, where sat Mr. Brownlow and his friend Mr. Grimwig, with decanters and glasses before them. The latter gentleman at once burst into the exclamation, "A beadle! A parish beadle, or I'll eat my head!" "Pray don't interrupt just now," said Mr. Brownlow. "Take a seat, will you?" Mr. Bumble sat himself down, quite confounded by the oddity of Mr. Grimwig's manner. Mr. Brownlow moved the lamp so as to obtain an uninterrupted view of the beadle's countenance, and said with a little impatience, "Now, sir, you come in consequence of having seen the advertisement?" "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bumble. "And you are a beadle, are you not?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "I am a parochial beadle, gentlemen," rejoined Mr. Bumble proudly. "Of course," observed Mr. Grimwig, aside to his friend. "I knew he was. A beadle all over." Mr. Brownlow gently shook his head to impose silence on his friend and resumed, "Do you know where this poor boy is now?" "No more than nobody," replied Mr. Bumble. "Well, what do you know of him?" inquired the old gentleman. "Speak out, my friend, if you have anything to say. What do you know of him?" "You don't happen to know any good of him, do you?" said Mr. Grimwig, caustically, after an attentive perusal of Mr. Bumble's features. Mr. Bumble, catching at the inquiry very quickly, shook his head with portentous solemnity. "You see," said Mr. Grimwig, looking triumphantly at Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow looked apprehensively at Mr. Bumble's pursed-up countenance, and requested him to communicate what he knew regarding Oliver in as few words as possible. Mr. Bumble put his hat down, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, inclined his head in a retrospective manner, and after a few moments' reflection, commenced his story. It would be tedious if given in the beadle's words, accompanying, as it did, some 20 minutes in the telling, but the sum and substance of it was that Oliver was a foundling, born of low and vicious parents, that he had from his birth displayed no better qualities than treachery, ingratitude, and malice, that he had terminated his brief career in the place of his birth by making a sanguinary and cowardly attack on an unoffending lad and running away in the night time from his master's house. In proof of his really being the person he represented himself, Mr. Bumble laid upon the table the papers he had brought to town. Folding his arms again, he then awaited Mr. Brownlow's observations.
"I fear it is all too true," said the old man sorrowfully, after looking over the papers. "This is not much for your intelligence, but I would gladly have given you treble the money if it had been favorable to the boy."
Treble, consisting of 3 parts, threefold. It is not improbable that if Mr. Bumble had been possessed of this information at an earlier period of the interview, he might have imparted a very different colouring to his little history. It was too late to do it now, however, so he shook his head gravely, and pocketing the 5 guineas, withdrew. Mr. Brownlow paced the room to and fro for some minutes, evidently so much disturbed by the beadle's tale that even Mr. Grimwig forbore to vex him further. At length he stopped and rang the bell violently. Cling, 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 cling.
"Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow when the housekeeper arrived, "that boy, Oliver, is an impostor."
"It can't be, sir. It cannot be," said the old lady energetically.
"I tell you he is," retorted the old gentleman. "What do you mean by can't be? We have just heard a full account of him from his birth, and he has been a thorough-paced little villain all his life."
"I never will believe it, sir," replied the old lady firmly. "Never!"
"You old women never believe anything but quack doctors and lying storybooks," growled Mr. Grimwig. "I knew it all along. Why didn't you take my advice in the beginning? You would if he hadn't had a fever, I suppose, eh? He was interesting, wasn't he? Interesting! Bah!"
And Mr. Grimwig poked the fire with a flourish. "He was a dear, grateful, gentle child, sir," retorted Mrs. Bedwin indignantly. "I know what children are, sir, and have done these 40 years, and people who can't say the same shouldn't say anything about them. That's my opinion." This was a hard hit at Mr. Grimwig, who was a bachelor, as it extorted nothing from that gentleman but a smile. The old lady tossed her head and smoothed down her apron preparatory to another speech, when she was stopped by Mr. Brownlow.
"Silence!"
said the old gentleman, feigning an anger he was far from feeling.
"Never let me hear the boy's name again. I rang to tell you that. Never, never on any pretense, mind. You may leave the room, Mrs. Bedwin. Remember, I am in earnest."
There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's that night. Oliver's heart sank within him when he thought of his good friends. It was well for him that he could not know what they had heard, or it might have broken outright. Chapter 18. How Oliver passed his time in the improving society of his reputable friends. About noon next day, when the Dodger and Master Bates had gone out to pursue their customary avocations, Mr. Fagin took the opportunity of reading Oliver a long lecture on the crying sin of ingratitude, of which he clearly demonstrated he had been guilty, to no ordinary extent, in wilfully absenting himself from the society of his anxious friends, and, still more, in endeavouring to escape from them after so much trouble and expense had been incurred in his recovery. Mr. Fagin laid great stress on the fact of his having taken Oliver in and cherished him when without his timely aid he might have perished with hunger, and he related the dismal and affecting history of a young lad whom, in his philanthropy, he had succored under parallel circumstances, but who, proving unworthy of his confidence and evincing a desire to communicate with the police, had unfortunately come to be hanged at the Old Bailey one morning. Mr. Fagin did not seek to conceal his share in the catastrophe, but lamented with tears in his eyes that the wrong-headed and treacherous behaviour of the young person in question had rendered it necessary that he should become the victim of certain evidence for the Crown, which, if it were not precisely true, was indispensably necessary for the safety of him, Mr. Fagin, and a few select friends. Mr. Fagin concluded by drawing a rather disagreeable picture of the discomforts of hanging, and, with great friendliness and politeness of manner, expressed his anxious hopes that he might never be obliged to submit Oliver Twist to that unpleasant operation. Little Oliver's blood ran cold as he listened to the Jew's words, and imperfectly comprehended the dark threats conveyed in them, that it was possible even for justice itself to confound the innocent with the guilty when they were in accidental companionship, he knew already, and that deeply laid plans for the destruction of inconveniently knowing or over-communicative persons had been really devised and carried out by the Jew on more occasions than one. He thought by no means unlikely, when he recollected the general nature of the altercations between that gentleman and Mr. Sykes, which seemed to bear reference to some foregone conspiracy of the kind. As he glanced timidly up and met the Jew's searching look, he felt that his pale face and trembling limbs were neither unnoticed nor unrelished by that wary old gentleman. The Jew, smiling hideously, patted Oliver on the head, and said that if he kept himself quiet and applied himself to business, he saw that they would be very good friends yet. Then, taking his hat and covering himself with an old patched greatcoat, he went out and locked the room door behind him. Click! And so Oliver remained all that day, and for the greater part of many subsequent days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight, and left during the long hours to commune with his own thoughts. And left during the long hours to commune with his own thoughts, which, never failing to revert to his kind friends and the opinion they must long ago have formed of him, was sad indeed. After the lapse of a week or so, the Jew left the room door unlocked, and he was at liberty to wander about the house. It was a very dirty place. The rooms upstairs had great high wooden chimney pieces and large doors, with panelled walls and cornices to the ceiling, which, although they were black with neglect and dust, were ornamented in various ways. From all of these tokens, Oliver concluded that a long time ago, before the old Jew was born, it had belonged to better people, and had perhaps been quite gay and handsome, dismal and dreary as it looked now. Spiders had built their webs in the angles of the walls and ceilings, and sometimes when Oliver walked softly into a room, the mice would scamper across the floor and run back terrified to their holes. With these exceptions, there was neither sight nor sound of any living thing, and often, when it grew dark and he was tired of wandering from room to room, he would crouch in the corner of the passage by the street door to be as near living people as he could, and would remain there listening and counting the hours until the Jew or the boys returned. In all the rooms, the mouldering shutters were fast closed. The bars which held them were screwed tight into the wood. The only light which was admitted, stealing its way through round holes at the top, which made the rooms more gloomy and filled them with strange shadows. There was a back garret window with rusty bars outside, which had no shutter, and out of this Oliver often gazed with a melancholy face for hours together. But nothing was to be descried from it but a confused and crowded mass of housetops, blackened chimneys, and gable ends. Sometimes, indeed, a grisly head might be seen, peering over the parapet wall of a distant house, but it was quickly withdrawn again, and as the window of Oliver's observatory was nailed down and dimmed with the rain and smoke of years, it was as much as he could do to make out the forms of the different objects beyond, without making any attempt to be seen or heard, which he had as much chance of being as if he had lived inside the ball of St. Paul's Cathedral. One afternoon, the Dodger and Master Bates being engaged out that evening, the first named young gentleman took it into his head to evince some anxiety regarding the decoration of his person. To do him justice, this was by no means an habitual weakness with him. And with this end and aim, he condescendingly commanded Oliver to assist him in his toilet straight away. Oliver was but too glad to make himself useful, too happy to have some faces, however bad, to look upon, too desirous to conciliate those about him when he could honestly do so, to throw any objection in the way of this proposal. So he at once expressed his readiness, and kneeling on the floor while the Dodger sat upon the table so that he could take his foot in his laps, he applied himself to a process which Mr. Dawkins designated as japanning his trotter cases. The phrase, rendered into plain English, signifieth cleaning his boots. Whether it was the sense of freedom and independence which a rational animal may be supposed to feel when he sits on a table in an easy attitude, smoking a pipe, swinging one leg carelessly to and fro, and having his boots cleaned all the time, without even the past trouble of having taken them off, or the prospective misery of putting them on to disturb his reflections, or whether it was the goodness of the tobacco that soothed the feelings of the Dodger, or the mildness of the beer that mollified his thoughts, he was evidently tinctured. For the nonce, with a spice of romance and enthusiasm foreign to his general nature. Tinctured.
Tinctured.
Tinctured. Tincture, a medicine made by dissolving a drug in alcohol. A slight trace of something. Tincture. He was evidently tinctured, for the nonce, with a spice of romance and enthusiasm foreign to his general nature. He looked down on Oliver with a thoughtful countenance for a brief space, and then, raising his head and heaving a gentle sigh, said, half in abstraction and half to Master Bates, "What a pity it is he isn't a prig!" "Ah," said Master Charles Bates, "he don't know what's good for him." The Dodger sighed again, and resumed his pipe, as did Charlie Bates. They both smoked for some seconds in silence. "I suppose you don't even know what a prig is," said the Dodger mournfully. "I think I know that," replied Oliver, looking up. "It's, You're one, are you not?" inquired Oliver, checking himself. "I am," replied the Dodger. "I'd scorn to be anything else." Mr. Dawkins gave his hat a ferocious cock after delivering this sentiment, and looked at Master Bates, as if to denote that he would feel obliged by his saying anything to the contrary. "I am," repeated the Dodger. "So's Charlie, so's Fagin, so's Sykes, so's Nancy, so's Bet. So we all are, down to the dog. And he's the downiest one of the lot." "And the least given to preaching," added Charlie Bates. "He wouldn't so much as bark in a witness box for fear of committing himself. No, not if you tied him up in one. No, not if you tied him up in one and left him there without victuals for a fortnight," said the Dodger. "Not a bit of it," observed Charlie. "He's a rum dog. Don't he look fierce at any strange cove that laughs or sings when he's in company?" pursued the Dodger. "Won't he growl at all when he hears a fiddle playing? And don't he hate other dogs as ain't of his breed? Oh, no." "He's an out-and-out Christian," said Charlie. This was merely intended as a tribute to the animal's abilities, but it was an appropriate remark in another sense. If Master Bates had only known it, for there are a good many ladies and gentlemen claiming to be out-and-out Christians, between whom and Mr. Sykes's dog there existed strong and singular points of resemblance. "Well, well," said the Dodger, recurring to the point from which they had strayed, with that mindfulness of his profession which influenced all his proceedings. "This hasn't got anything to do with young Green here." "No more it has," said Charlie. "Why don't you put yourself under Fagin, Oliver?" "And make your fortune out of hand," added the Dodger with a grin. "And so be able to retire on your property and do the genteel, as I mean to, in the very next leap year but 4 that ever comes, and the 42nd Tuesday in Trinity Week," said Charlie Bates. "I don't like it," rejoined Oliver timidly. "I wish they would let me go. I would rather go." "And Fagin would rather not," rejoined Charlie. Oliver knew this too well, but thinking it might be dangerous to express his feelings more openly, he only sighed, and went on with his boot cleaning. "Go!" exclaimed the Dodger. "Why, where's your spirit? Don't you take any pride out of yourself? Would you go and be dependent on your friends?" "Oh, blow that," said Master Bates, drawing 2 or 3 silk handkerchiefs from his pocket and tossing them into a cupboard. "That's too mean, that is." "I couldn't do it," said the Dodger, with an air of haughty disgust. "You can leave your friends, though," said Oliver with a half-smile, "and let them be punished for what you did." "That," rejoined the Dodger with a wave of his pipe, "that was all out of consideration for Fagin, 'cause the traps know that we work together, and he might have got into trouble if we hadn't made our lucky. That was the move, wasn't it, Charlie?" Master Bates nodded assent and would have spoken, but the recollection of Oliver's flight came so suddenly upon him that the smoke he was inhaling got entangled with a laugh and went up into his head and down into his throat, and brought on a fit of coughing and stamping. About 5 minutes long. "Look here," said the Dodger, drawing forth a handful of shillings and halfpence. "Here's a jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold. There's plenty more where they were took from. You won't you? Oh, you precious flat." "It's naughty, ain't it, Oliver?" inquired Charlie Bates. "He'll come to be scragged, won't he?" "I don't know what that means," replied Oliver. "Something in this way, old feller," said Charlie. As he said it, Master Bates caught up an end of his neckerchief and, holding it erect in the air, dropped his head on his shoulder and jerked a curious sound through his teeth, thereby indicating, by a lively pantomimic representation, that scragging and hanging were one and the same thing. "That's what it means," said Charlie. "Look how he stares, Jack." "I never did see such prime company as that 'ere boy. He'll be the death of me. I know he will." Master Charlie Bates, having laughed heartily again, resumed his pipe with tears in his eyes. "You've been brought up bad," said the Dodger, surveying his boots with much satisfaction when Oliver had polished them. "Fagin will make something of you, though, or you'll be the first he ever had that turned out unprofitable. You better begin at once, for you'll come to the trade long before you think of it, and you're only losing time, Oliver." Master Bates backed this advice with sundry moral admonitions of his own, which, being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dawkins launched into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favour without more delay, by the means which they themselves had employed to gain it. "And always put this in your pipe, Nolly," said the Dodger, as the Jew was heard unlocking the door above. "If you don't take foggles and tickers." "What's the good of talking in that way?" interposed Master Bates. "He don't know what you mean." "If you don't take pickpocket handkerchiefs and watches," said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity, "some other cove will, so that the coves that lose 'em will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse too, and nobody half a harp orth the better." and nobody half a ha'porth the better, except the chaps what gets 'em, and you've just as good a right to them as they have." To be sure, said the Jew, who had entered unseen by Oliver. "It's all lies in a nutshell, my dear, in a nutshell. Take the Dodger's word for it. He understands the catechism of his trade." The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning in these terms, and chuckled with delight at his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no farther at this time, for the Jew had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy and a gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but who was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance. Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards that young gentleman which seemed to indicate that he felt himself conscious of a slight inferiority in point of genius and professional acquirements. He had small twinkling eyes and a pock-marked face, wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, greasy fustian trousers, and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was only out an hour before. And that in consequence of having worn the regimentals for 6 weeks past, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with strong marks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedy against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting the hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 moral, long, hard working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he warn't as dry as a lime basket. "Where do you think the gentleman has come from, Oliver?" inquired the Jew with a grin as the other boys put a bottle of spirits on the table. I don't know, sir," replied Oliver. "Who's that?" inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver. "A young friend of mine, my dear," replied the Jew. "He's in luck, then," said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin. "Never mind where I came from, young'un. You'll find your way there soon enough. I'll bet a crown." At this sally, the boys laughed. After some more jokes on the same subject, they exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin, and withdrew. After some words apart between the last comer and Fagin, they drew their chairs towards the fire, and the Jew, telling Oliver to come and sit by him, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, the proficiency of the Dodger, the amiability of Charlie Bates, and the liberality of the Jew himself. At length, these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted, and Mr. Chitling did the same, for the house of correction becomes fatiguing after a week or two. Miss Betsy accordingly withdrew and left the party to their repose. From this day, Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with the two boys, who played the old game with the Jew every day, whether for their own improvement or Oliver's, Mr. Fagin best knew. At other times the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much that was droll and curious that Oliver could not help laughing heartily and showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings. In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils, having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place. He was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. Chapter 19, in which a notable plan is discussed and determined on. It was a chill, damp, windy night, when the Jew, buttoning his great coat tight round his shriveled body and pulling the collar up over his ears so as completely to obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighbourhood of Whitechapel. The Jew stopped for an instant at the corner of the street, and glancing suspiciously round, crossed the road and struck off in the direction of the Spital Fields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on his course through many winding and narrow ways until he reached Bethnal Green. Then, turning suddenly off to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of the mean and dirty streets which abound in that close and densely populated quarter. The Jew was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed to be at all bewildered either by the darkness of the night or the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleys and streets, and at length turned into one, lighted only by a single lamp at the farther end. At the door of a house in this street he knocked. Having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened it, he walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of the room door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill. Only me, my dear," said the Jew, looking in.
"Bring in your body, then," said Sykes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got a great coat on?"
Apparently, the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as the Jew unbuttoned it and threw it over the back of a chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went, to show that he was as well satisfied as it was in his nature to be.
"Well?"
said Sykes. "Well, my dear," replied the Jew. "Ah, Nancy!" The latter recognition was uttered with just enough of embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met since she had interfered in behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were speedily removed by the young lady's behaviour. She took her feet off the fender, pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin draw up his, without saying more about it, for it was a cold night, and no mistake. "It is cold, Nancy, dear," said the Jew, as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his side.
It must be a piercer if it finds its way through your heart, said Mr. Sykes. Give him something to drink, Nancy. Burn my body, make haste. It's enough to turn a man ill to see his lean old carcass shivering in that way like an ugly ghost just rose from the grave.
Nancy quickly brought a bottle from a cupboard in which there were many, which, to judge from the diversity of their appearance, were filled with several kinds of liquids. Sykes, pouring out a glass of brandy, bade the Jew drink it off. "Quite enough, quite, thank ye, Bill," replied the Jew, putting down the glass after just setting his lips to it.
What? You're afraid of our getting the better of you, are you? Inquired Sykes, fixing his eyes on the Jew. Ugh!
With a hoarse grunt of contempt, Mr. Sykes seized the glass and threw the remainder of its contents into the ashes as a preparatory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. As a preparatory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. The Jew glanced round the room as his companion tossed down the second glassful, not in curiosity, for he had seen it often before, but in a restless and suspicious manner habitual to him. It was a meanly furnished apartment, with nothing but the contents of the closet to induce the belief that its occupier was anything but a working man, and with no more suspicious articles displayed to view than 2 or 3 heavy bludgeons which stood in a corner, and a life-preserver that hung over the chimney-piece.
There, said Sykes, smacking his lips. Now I'm ready.
For business? Inquired the Jew.
For business, replied Sykes. So say what you've got to say.
About the crib at XVIII, Bill? Said the Jew, drawing his chair forward and speaking in a very low voice.
Yes? What about it?
Inquired Sykes. Ah, you know what I mean, my dear, said the Jew. He knows what I mean, Nancy, don't he?
No, he don't, sneered Mr. Sykes. Oh, he won't, and that's the same thing. Speak out and call things by their right names. Don't sit there winking and blinking and talking to me in hints as if you weren't the very first that thought about the robbery. What do you mean?
Hush, Bill, hush, said the Jew, who had in vain attempted to stop this burst of indignation. Somebody will hear us, my dear. Somebody will hear us.
Let him hear, said Sykes. I don't care.
But as Mr. Sykes did care on reflection, he dropped his voice as he said the words and grew calmer. There, said the Jew coaxingly. It was only my caution, nothing more. Now, my dear, about that crib at XVIII. When is it to be done, Bill, eh? When is it to be done? Such plate, my dear, such plate, said the Jew, rubbing his hands and elevating his eyebrows in a rapture of anticipation.
Not at all.
replied Sykes coldly. Not to be done at all, echoed the Jew, leaning back in his chair.
No, not at all,
rejoined Sykes.
At least it can't be a put-up job as we expected.
Then it hasn't been properly gone about, said the Jew, turning pale with anger. Don't tell me!
But I will tell you,
retorted Sykes.
Who are you that's not to be told? I tell you that Toby Crackit has been hanging about the place for a fortnight and he can't get one of the servants in line.
Do you mean to tell me, Bill, said the Jew, softening as the other grew heated, that neither of the two men in the house can be got over?
Yes, I do mean to tell you so, replied Sykes. The old lady has had him these 20 years, and if you were to give him £500, they wouldn't be in it.
But do you mean to say, my dear, remonstrated the Jew, that the women can't be got over?
Not a bit of it, replied Sykes.
Not by Flash Toby Crackit, said the Jew incredulously, in a manner indicating disbelief. Not by Flash Toby Crackit, said the Jew incredulously. Think what women are, Bill.
No, not even by Flash Toby Crackit, replied Sykes. He says he's worn sham whiskers and a canary waistcoat the whole blessed time he's been loitering down there, and it's all of no use.
He should have tried mustachios and a pair of military trousers, my dear, said the Jew.
So he did, rejoined Sykes, and they weren't of no more use than the other plant.
The Jew looked blank at this information after ruminating for some minutes with his chin sunk on his breast. He raised his head and said with a deep sigh that if Flash Toby Crackit reported aright, he feared the game was up. And yet, said the old man, dropping his hands on his knees, it's a sad thing, my dear, to lose so much when we had set our hearts upon it.
So it is,
said Mr. Sykes.
Worse luck.
A long silence ensued, during which the Jew was plunged in deep thought, with his face wrinkled into an expression of villainy perfectly demoniacal. Sykes eyed him furtively from time to time. Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire, as if she had been deaf to all that passed.
Fagin,
said Sykes, abruptly breaking the stillness that prevailed.
Is it worth 50 shiners extra, if it's safely done from the outside?
Yes, said the Jew, as suddenly rousing himself.
Is it a bargain?
inquired Sykes. Yes, my dear, yes, rejoined the Jew, his eyes glistening and every muscle in his face working with the excitement that the inquiry had awakened.
Then,
said Sykes, thrusting aside the Jew's hand with some disdain,
let it come off as soon as you like. Toby and me were over the garden wall the night before last, sounding the panels of the door and shutters. The crib's barred up at night like a jail, but there's one part we can crack, safe and softly.
Which is that, Bill? asked the Jew eagerly.
Why, whispered Sykes, as you cross the lawn.
Yes, said the Jew, bending his head forward with his eyes almost starting out of it.
Oomph!
cried Sykes, stopping short, as the girl, scarcely moving her head, looked suddenly round and pointed for an instant to the Jew's face.
Never mind which part it is. You can't do it without me, I know, but it's best to be on the safe side when one deals with you.
As you like, my dear, as you like, replied the Jew. Is there no help wanted but yours and Toby's?
None, said Sykes, except a centre bit and a boy. The first we've both got. The second you must find us.
A boy! Exclaimed the Jew. Oh, then it's a panelly.
Never mind what it is, replied Sykes. I want a boy, and he mustn't be a big un, Lord, said Mr. Sykes reflectively. If I'd only got that young boy of Ned, the chimbley sweepers. He kept him small on purpose and let him out by the job. But the father gets lagged, and then the Juvenile Delinquent Society comes and takes the boy away from a trade where he was earning money, teaches him to read and write, and in time makes apprentice of him. And so they go on, said Mr. Sykes, his wrath rising with the recollection of his wrongs. So they go on, and if they got money enough, which it's a providence they haven't, we shouldn't have half a dozen boys left in the whole trade in a year or two.
No more we should, acquiesced the Jew, who had been considering during this speech and had only caught the last sentence. Bill!
What now?
inquired Sykes. The Jew nodded his head towards Nancy, who was still gazing at the fire, and, intimidated by a sign that he would have her told to leave the room, Sykes shrugged his shoulders impatiently, as if he thought the precaution unnecessary, but complied nevertheless, by requesting Miss Nancy to fetch him a jug of beer. You don't want any beer, said Nancy, folding her arms and retaining her seat very composedly.
I tell you, I do, replied Sykes.
Nonsense, rejoined the girl coolly. Go on, Fagin. I know what he's going to say, Bill. He needn't mind me. The Jew still hesitated. Sykes looked from one to the other in some surprise.
Why, you don't mind the old girl, do you, Fagin?
He asked at length.
You've known her long enough to trust her, or the devil's in it. She ain't one to blab, are you, Nancy?
I should think not, replied the young lady, drawing her chair up to the table and putting her elbows upon it. No, no, my dear, I know you're not, said the Jew. But, and again the old man paused.
But what?
inquired Sykes. I don't know whether she mightn't perhaps be out of sorts, you know, my dear, as she was the other night, replied the Jew. At this confession, Miss Nancy burst into a loud laugh. And swallowing a glass of brandy, shook her head with an air of defiance, and burst into sundry exclamations of, "Keep the game a-going! Never say die!" and the like. These seemed to have the effect of reassuring both gentlemen, for the Jew nodded his head with a satisfied air and resumed his seat, as did Mr. Sykes likewise. Now, Fagin, said Nancy with a laugh, tell Bill at once about Oliver. Ha! You're a clever one, my dear. The sharpest girl I ever saw, said the Jew, patting her on the neck. It was about Oliver I was going to speak, sure enough.
What about him?
demanded Sykes. He's the boy for you, my dear, replied the Jew in a hoarse whisper, laying his finger on the side of his nose and grinning frightfully.
He?
exclaimed Sykes. Have him, Bill, said Nancy. I would, if I was in your place. He mightn't be so much up as any of the others, but that's not what you want. If he's only to open a door for you, depend upon it, he's a safe one, Bill. I know he is, rejoined Fagin. He's been in good training these last few weeks, and it's time he began to work for his bread. Besides, the others are all too big.
Well, he is just the size I want, said Mr. Sykes, ruminating.
And we'll do everything you want, Bill, my dear, interposed the Jew. He can't help himself, that is, if you frighten him enough.
Frighten him?
Echoed Sykes.
It'll be no sham frightening, mind you. If there's anything queer about him when we once get into the work, in for a penny, in for a pound. You won't see him alive again, Fagin. Think of that before you send him. Mark my words,
said the robber, poising a crowbar which he had drawn from under the bedstead. I've thought of it all, said the Jew with energy. I've had my eyes upon him, my dears. Close, close. Once let him feel that he is one of us. Once fill his mind with the idea that he has been a thief, and he's ours for his life. Oh, it couldn't have come about better. The old man crossed his arms upon his breast, and drawing his head and shoulders into a heap, literally hugged himself for joy.
Ours,
said Sykes.
Yours, you mean?
Perhaps I do, my dear, said the Jew with a shrill chuckle. Mine, if you like, Bill.
And what?
Said Sykes, scowling fiercely on his agreeable friend.
What makes you take so much pains about one chalk-faced kid, when you know there are 50 boys snoozing about common garden every night, as you might pick and choose from?
Because they're of no use to me, my dear, replied the Jew with some confusion. Not worth the taking. Their looks convict him when they get into trouble, and I lose him all. With this boy, properly managed, my dears, I could do what I couldn't with 20 of them. Besides, said the Jew, recovering his self-possession, he has us now, if he could only give us leg bail again, and he must be in the same boat with us. Never mind how he came there, it's quite enough for my power over him that he was in a robbery. That's all I want. Now, how much better this is than being obliged to put the poor little boy out of the way, which would be dangerous, and we should lose by it besides. When is it to be done? Asked Nancy, stopping some turbulent exclamation on the part of Mr. Sykes, expressive of the disgust with which he received Fagin's affectation of humanity. Ah, to be sure, said the Jew. When is it to be done, Bill?
I planned with Toby the night after tomorrow, rejoined Sykes in a surly voice. If he heard nothing from me to the contrary.
Good, said the Jew. There's no moon.
No,
rejoined Sykes. It's all arranged about bringing off the swag, is it? Asked the Jew. Sykes nodded. And about...
It's all planned, rejoined Sykes, interrupting him. Never mind particulars. You'd better bring the boy here tomorrow night. I shall get off the stone an hour after daybreak. Then you hold your tongue and keep the melting pot ready, and that's all you'll have to do.
After some discussion in which all three took an active part, it was decided that Nancy should repair to the Jew's next evening when the night had set in, and bring Oliver away with her. Fagin craftily observing that if he evinced any disinclination to the task, he would be more willing to accompany the girl who had so recently interfered in his behalf than anybody else. It was also solemnly arranged that poor Oliver should, for the purposes of the contemplated expedition, be unreservedly consigned to the care and custody of Mr. William Sykes, and further that the said Sykes should deal with him as he thought fit, and should not be held responsible by the Jew for any mischance or evil that might be necessary to visit him, it being understood that, to render the compact in this respect binding, any representations made by Sykes on his return should be required to be confirmed and corroborated in all important particulars by the testimony of Flash Toby Crackit. These preliminaries adjusted, Mr. Sykes proceeded to drink brandy at a furious rate, and to flourish the crowbar in an alarming manner, yelling forth at the same time most unmusical snatches of song mingled with wild execrations. Execrations. Feel or express great loathing for. Mingled with wild execrations. At length, in a fit of professional enthusiasm, he insisted upon producing his box of house-breaking tools, which he had no sooner stumbled in with, and opened for the purpose of explaining the nature and properties of the various implements it contained, and the peculiar beauties of their construction. Then he fell over the box upon the floor and went to sleep where he fell. "Good night, Nancy," said the Jew, muffling himself up as before. "Good night." Their eyes met, and the Jew scrutinized her narrowly. There was no flinching about the girl. She was as true and earnest in the matter as Toby Crackit himself could be. The Jew again bade her good night, and, bestowing a sly kick upon the prostrate form of Mr. Sykes, while her back was turned, groped downstairs. "Always the way," muttered the Jew to himself as he turned homeward. "The worst of these women is that a very little thing serves to call up some long-forgotten feeling, and the best of them is that it never lasts. The man against the child, for a bag of gold." Beguiling the time with these pleasant reflections, Mr. Fagin wended his way, through mud and mire, to his gloomy abode, where the Dodger was sitting up, impatiently awaiting his return. "Is Oliver abed? I want to speak to him," was his first remark as they descended the stairs. "How does it go?" replied the Dodger, throwing open a door. "Here he is." The boy was lying fast asleep on a rude bed upon the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness, and the closeness of his prison, that he looked like death. Not death as it shows in shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when a young and gentle spirit has, but an instant, fled to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not had time to breathe upon the changing dust it hallowed. "Not now," said the Jew, turning softly away. Tomorrow.